On the 15th of September 1982, Queen played a concert at the Forum in Inglewood, California. They had played the Forum before. They played it that night as they played every venue they played, with complete commitment, with the full production, with Freddie Mercury giving everything he had to the crowd that was there. When the show ended, they walked off the stage. They did not make a speech. They did not say goodbye, because it was not goodbye. It was just the end of a show, the end of a tour, the end of a busy year. Freddie Mercury walked off the stage at the Inglewood Forum and flew back to England and never performed in the United States again. That was in 1982. He died in 1991. For 9 years, for the rest of his life, the most successful British rock band of the 1970s did not play a single concert in the largest music market in the world. Nobody in the crowd at the Inglewood Forum that September night knew they were watching the last one. Nobody on stage knew they were giving it, and the specific quality of not knowing the same quality that made Nebworth in 1986 what it was, is the thing that makes the 1982 Inglewood Forum concert into something it was not, in the moment, understood to be. The story of how Queen lost America is a story told in layers, and each layer requires the one beneath it to be fully understood. The surface layer is the Hot Space story, the album that alienated the American rock audience with its disco and funk direction, the disco sucks banners at concerts, the commercial disappointment of an album that was doing something interesting and doing it badly for the market it was being sold into. Below that is the story of Freddie Mercury's changing public image, the thick mustache, the tight clothing, the specific gay clone aesthetic that Rolling Stone identified as a factor in the American audience's withdrawal, and the razor blades that some audience members threw onto the stage at certain 1980 U.S. shows to communicate their rejection of it. Below that is the story of Sun City in 1984, which closed the American market for different reasons. And below all of those specific causes is something more structural. The American music market of the early 1980s was shifting away from the kind of rock grandeur that Queen represented. In the band's response to that shift, Hot Space, the dance direction, the synthesizers was read by American audiences as abandonment rather than evolution. Roger Taylor said of the final American years that he suddenly realized they weren't packing them in quite as much as they used to. This observation, made with the specific understatement that Roger Taylor uses for things that actually hurt, is the closest any member of Queen came, in public, to acknowledging the full extent of what was happening. Brian May said years later that they always assumed they would go back to America, that events overtook them. The assumption of return is itself revealing. The last U.S. concert was not framed as a farewell. It was framed as a pause that lasted 9 years, until Freddie Mercury died. And that made the Inglewood Forum concert into the last American concert by retroactive logic, because what came after the pause made the pause permanent. Think about what was lost when America closed. Not commercially, though the commercial loss was real and significant. Think about what was lost in terms of what America had meant to Freddie Mercury specifically. He had wanted to conquer America the way he had wanted to conquer every market completely, without reservation, in the specific way that Freddie Mercury wanted to do things. He had come close. The game had gone to #1 in the U.S. Another one, Bites the Dust, had gone to #1. Queen had filled arenas, and then it had started to slip, and the slipping had accelerated, and the Hot Space Tour had confirmed that the ground was shifting, and after the Inglewood Forum concert of September 1982, the ground was gone. Freddie Mercury knew America would never be what he had wanted it to be. He said as much, in various forms, in various interviews across the years between 1982 and his death. He remained to the end of his life frustrated by what had not been achieved there. The crowd at the Inglewood Forum on the 15th of September, 1982 was a real crowd. Not the biggest Queen had played in America. The peak American years of 1980 had seen larger venues. But real, committed, enthusiastic, the specific remaining American Queen audience that had stayed through Hot Space when others had drifted away. They came and they watched and they sang along and they went home. And the band packed up the production and flew back to England, and the tour was over. Brian May did not know, as he packed up the red special in its case in the Inglewood Forum backstage, that this was the last time he would pack it up after an American concert. Roger Taylor did not know, as he broke down his drum kit, that the next time he would set it up in America would be 23 years later, in 2005, with Paul Rodgers on lead vocals instead of Freddie Mercury. John Deacon did not know. Freddie Mercury did not know. They just packed up. They just flew home. The Hot Space Tour had been difficult for reasons beyond the commercial. The band's internal relationships, which had been under strain during the album's recording, were at a low point by the end of the tour. Brian May said, in a quote that became one of the most honest things he ever said about this period, "After the Hot Space Tour concluded, we hated each other for a while." That is not hyperbole. That is a man describing 9 months during which the four people who made up Queen barely spoke, 9 months of mutual withdrawal, following the specific exhaustion of a difficult tour in support of a difficult album in markets that were making very clear that the difficult album had been a mistake. The last American concert was given in the middle of all of this. Not by a band at the peak of their confidence and their commercial power, by a band that was behind the professional surface of a completed show in a completed venue, in significant internal trouble. Brian May told the story of the last American concert in a specific way when he was asked about it. They always assumed they would go back. Events overtook them. This formulation is both true and evasive in the specific way that true things can be evasive when the full truth is more complicated than a sentence allows. The events that overtook them were not mysterious or impersonal. They were Sun City, which made a Queen tour of America politically complicated. They were Freddie Mercury's growing comfort with the European circuit and the South American audiences that had adopted the band so completely. They were the specific conditions of Freddie's private life in Munich and then in London that made sustained American touring less appealing than it had once been. And they were, from 1987, the diagnosis, the specific and absolute condition that made the planning of a major American tour impossible in the way that planning anything major was impossible after the diagnosis. The last song Queen played at the Inglewood Forum on the 15th of September, 1982, was "We Are the Champions." This is not confirmed by a complete setlist record. The tour setlist varied night to night, but it was the standard final encore of the Hot Space Tour. And it is more likely than not that the last note Freddie Mercury played in America was the final note of that song. "We are the champions of the world." He sang it in Inglewood and walked off the stage, and the crowd filed out into the September night and went home. And it was over, and nobody knew it was over. Not the crowd, not the band, not Freddie Mercury, who would spend the rest of his life occasionally expressing regret that Queen never got back to America in the way it deserved. The song that the crowd sang back at him was about winning. The thing that was happening as they sang it was a loss that nobody had recognized as a loss. The 2005 Queen plus Paul Rodgers tour did bring Queen back to America 23 years after the Inglewood Forum concert, without Freddie Mercury, with a different singer and a different context. Brian May and Roger Taylor performed in American arenas again. They played Freddie's songs. They did what they could with what they had in the place they had left behind. It was not nothing. It was not the same. Brian May has spoken about the American returns with a quality of emotional complication that is consistent, gratitude for the welcome, and a specific sadness that is not about the Paul Rodgers shows themselves, but about what they proved that American audiences still had space for Queen's music, and that Freddie Mercury was not there to receive the welcome that the music still warranted. The razor blades are the detail that this story keeps returning to. At certain concerts on the 1980 American Game Tour, the last American tour before 1982, the last tour before the one that ended with the last concert, some members of the audience threw disposable razor blades onto the stage. Rolling Stone's Michael Gilmore wrote that this was because fans didn't like what they perceived as a brazenly gay rock and roll hero. They wanted him to shed the mustache, the image, the identity. They threw blades to tell him so. Freddie Mercury did not shed anything. He kept the mustache. He kept the image. He kept the identity that the razor blades were telling him to abandon. And then 2 years later, after one more tour, the country that had thrown the razor blades became a country he no longer performed in. The connection between those two facts is not simple and not direct, but it is present in the specific way that things that happened in sequence are always present in the story of what came after. Queen returned to America in the imagination of their American fans through Bohemian Rhapsody. The 2018 film performed extraordinarily well in the United States, introducing Queen to a new generation of American listeners who had grown up after the band's final American tours, who knew Bohemian Rhapsody as a song but not as a band. The film created, in the American market, something close to the mass popular embrace that Queen had always wanted and never quite achieved in their performing years. It arrived as the most significant American returns tend to arrive in this story after Freddie Mercury was no longer alive to experience it. He had wanted America. America came to him through a movie 27 years after he died. The timing, as always in this story, is everything. Freddie Mercury expressed frustration about America in interviews across the years following the last U.S. tour. He did not express resignation. He talked about wanting to go back. He talked about wanting the final album Innuendo to be accepted in America in the way it was accepted in Europe. Brian May, reporting this, said it with the specific quality of a man describing something that matters because it was never achieved. Freddie was very keen for that last album to be accepted in the States. Not the commercial success, the acceptance, the specific form of recognition that the American market, with all its scale and all its cultural weight, had not fully given Queen in the years when they were touring there, and that Freddie Mercury wanted and did not receive. He died wanting it. That is the last thing this story leaves with you about Freddie Mercury in America. The interval between the last American concert and Freddie Mercury's death was 9 years. In those 9 years, the world changed in ways that made a Queen return to America both more and less possible at different moments. The AIDS crisis changed the American cultural landscape in ways that affected how a gay British rock star was received and how a band associated with him was received. Freddie Mercury's private management of his diagnosis and his identity during those years meant that the specific political and cultural conditions for a return were never quite right or never quite pursued, or as Brian May has always said, events simply overtook them. 9 years. The last concert unannounced. The return never made. The champion still wanting to be heard. Nobody in the crowd at the Inglewood Forum on the 15th of September, 1982, was told they were watching the last Queen concert in America. There was no announcement, no special set list, no acknowledgement from the stage that this night was different from any other night. It was a show. It was well performed. The crowd went home, and Freddie Mercury drove to the airport, flew back across the Atlantic, and spent the rest of his life in a world where the country that had thrown razor blades at his identity had become a country he no longer visited. Whether that connection is causal or incidental, whether the razor blades and the image and the hot space failure and the Sun City aftermath and the diagnosis all contributed to the permanent American absence, in proportions that can be identified and weighed, is a question that nobody has fully answered, including the people who lived it. The last note Freddie Mercury ever sang in the United States of America was sung at the Inglewood Forum in September 1982. We do not know the exact note. We do not know the exact song. We know the venue, the date, the tour, and the fact that after that date, there were no more. He sang in America, and then he stopped. And the stopping was not an announcement, but a slow accumulation of events that made the last time in retrospect rather than in the moment. This is how most last times work. They do not announce themselves. They happen. And then later, from a distance that contains everything that came after, you recognize what they were. The crowd at the Inglewood Forum went home. Freddie Mercury went home. And the last concert in America was already over, already becoming the permanent goodbye that nobody at the Forum had known they were part of.